Electricity is like the lifeline of a country. Shut it down and everything falls apart. Take Hurricane Maria in 2017. It slammed into Puerto Rico, leaving millions powerless for months. No water, no communication. Hospitals barely running and businesses stuck. A staggering $90 billion in damages and years spent clawing back to normalcy. Now let's jump to Texas, February 2021. A brutal winter storm hits and millions are left freezing in the dark. Why?
Total power grid collapse.
The power grid wasn't ready. Wind turbines froze, natural gas plants shut down, and the whole system just failed. Factories stopped. Grocery stores ran out of food. Hospitals barely held on with backup generators. The whole state went into survival mode within days. The cost? Tens of billions. These disasters show one thing: without a strong power grid, everything we rely on, from hot showers to working Wi-Fi, can disappear overnight. Electricity isn't just a light switch, it's what keeps modern life running. That's why when the European Union assessed the challenges it faced after 2022, energy security was at the top of the list. In May 2022, the EU launched REPowerEU, a plan to upgrade Europe's energy system and cut its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. But wait, why does Europe need to repower? Did the system break? Not exactly. The system worked fine and wasn't too expensive, but we'll get to that later.
Don't touch that dial!
The real issue is this: when you suddenly stop buying energy from a major supplier, you feel the impact right away. So is Europe actually freezing because of this? Before you grab a blanket, let's break down what's really happening. Grab an extra blanket because we're breaking down the real impact of anti-Russian sanctions on Europe. Energy in Europe has always been a struggle. In 2020, the entire EU produced 394,000 barrels of oil per day. Sounds like a lot. Well, for the whole Union? No, not that one. That's just a drop in the barrel, especially considering that daily consumption was nearly 10 million barrels. Domestic production covered only about 4% of what Europe needed to function. Same story with natural gas. The EU extracted just 48 billion cubic meters that year, but used up nearly 380 billion. That means only 12.5% of the gas they needed came from within. The rest was imported. Then, in February 2022, you know who started you know what, and Europe had to make a choice. 1. Cut ties with its biggest energy supplier. 2. Find a way to keep the lights on without relying on them. The problem is that supplier was huge. In 2021, Russia was the number 1 exporter of natural gas, the number 2 exporter of crude oil, the number 3 exporter of coal. And guess where a big chunk of that was going? Straight to Europe. That same year, Russian energy covered nearly half of Europe's coal and gas needs and a third of its crude oil demand. It's hard to imagine Europe and Russia ever going back to the way things were not too long ago. It might seem like Europe and Russia were on track to keep this relationship going forever, but now it's clear, no matter how their relationship played out, there was only one way this could end. Here's what Europe's energy consumption looked like. Nearly 70% came from fossil fuels that were mostly imported, and a huge chunk of that came from Russia. So now Europe had to act fast. They launched REPowerEU, a plan to cut back on Russian fuel. They did this by investing in renewables, importing more energy from the US, and indirectly still buying Russian fuel through third-party countries. Now, Economics 101, what happens when the supply from your main supplier drops? I'm sure you already know the answer. Prices make stonks. On your screen, you'll see the price of natural gas for homes since 2008. Utility prices fluctuated between 6 to 8 cents. For 13 years, prices didn't go up too much, and in some years they even went down. But then came that fateful day, and prices nearly doubled, setting new records. And this matters because half of Europe's population is connected to the same gas network. For about 1/3 of all households, gas is the main heating source. So, did Europe actually freeze, like Russian news loves to say?
Как платить за электричество и газ волнует всех жителей Евросоюза.
Будет ли у французов свет на Рождество?
Продолжают отапливать свои дома дровами.
В Старом Свете наступило резкое похолодание. Запасов, чтобы пережить зиму, не хватает.
Of course not. Once again, narrow thinking prevents us from seeing the full picture. 30% as a heating source is significant but not overwhelming. After all, if 30% comes from gas, the remaining 70% comes from something else. And the EU wasn't putting all its bets on one thing. They spread their energy mix across multiple sources. In addition to gas, oil and solid fossil fuels, they also invested heavily in green energy, which now accounts for an equivalent of 23% of consumption, on par with gas. Here's the thing we should note. Renewable energy in 2022 was already on the same level as natural gas. So, if we're going to believe that Europe is freezing, we also have to believe that Europe is thriving green. In reality, Europe didn't freeze, nor did it go fully green. The truth is, after turning away from Russian energy instead of freezing, people just started paying a lot more to stay warm.
First time.
So, how much more are they really paying? Let's put some numbers on it. In 2021, only a quarter of the population spent more than 10% of their income on heating, but by early 2023, that number had risen to nearly half. In absolute terms, this means that after sanctions were imposed, 70 million citizens in Europe were affected by the rising heating costs. Of course, across different countries in the Union, no, not that one, the impact varied. But one way or another, everyone felt the pain. It wasn't just natural gas prices that went up, coal prices skyrocketed as well. They started rising in 2021, but the real spike came in February 2022. Prices doubled during that time. By the way, natural gas and oil prices rose almost in the same way, but despite simultaneous major military conflicts in Europe and the Middle East and restrictions on oil supplies from Russia, one of the biggest suppliers, oil prices still didn't set a new historical high. Maybe the oil economies of places like Russia or the Persian Gulf states enjoyed the nearly $40 per barrel price hike, but it wasn't as dramatic as expected. This made many rethink the future role of fossil fuels. Anyway, we're here to talk about the EU, and it's not just utility bills that went up. Transport costs shot through the roof too. Now, more than 6% of their income goes towards fuel, and it's not just 1 in 3 people, it's nearly 1 in 2 residents of the EU. Give me the numbers! We're talking about over 44 million car owners. Okay, so we already discussed gas and oil, but haven't yet talked about electricity. It might seem weird, but electricity isn't generated inside our power sockets.
Oh my god.
In fact, it's produced at power plants. Thermal, fuel-based, gas, and many others. And they all rely on that familiar big 3: natural gas, oil, and coal. It was only a matter of time before electricity prices rose. You've probably guessed it, in a global economy you can't sanction a major supplier without feeling it yourself. But beyond the simple rise in energy tariffs, which everyone felt one way or another, there are those who suffered even more than the rest. Let's say heating and car services are getting pricier, but the real question is, how badly is this hitting businesses? That's a great question. If we zoom in on how much electricity actually makes up the expenses of an average European business, the result is a shocking 1.7%. So, basically, no impact at all. Well, not really, that's just the average, and you know how averages work. If one person eats 2 whole pizzas and another person eats none, then on average they each had 1 pizza, even though one is in a food coma and the other is still starving. Those gluttonous fellas are the energy-intensive industries, the power-hungry machines that burn through massive amounts of energy just to keep running. For example, metallurgy, steel and aluminium plants where metal gets melted and shaped at hellish temperatures. Cement industry, no heat, no cement. No cement, no new buildings, simple as that. Chemical industry, fertilizers, plastics, industrial reagents, it's practically alchemy. These processes demand high temperatures, intense pressure, and a never-ending supply of electricity. Now, imagine starting a fertilizer business and checking your expenses. Surprise, 71% of your total costs are just electricity bills. Nearly 3/4 of your budget goes to keeping the lights on, and not even the fun neon ones. A similar cost breakdown applies to industries producing ferroalloys, silicon, ceramics, aluminium, glass containers, and zinc. By early 2022, energy costs in these sectors had skyrocketed by 20 to 55%. Remember the magic of averages. Countries aren't immune to this math trick either. This chart shows how electricity prices for industrial enterprises have changed worldwide. At first, Germany, France, and Poland were all in a similar spot, with Spain being slightly pricier. But then in 2022, things started to change. While France has not felt any negative impact, just like China, where electricity prices actually dropped, Spain saw a significant spike. But the real heroes here are Germany and Poland, where costs went through the roof, and in 2023 it only got worse. It's important to understand that if it weren't for the timely actions of European governments, the situation could have been much worse. In Poland, the price would have been even higher, 175 euro cents per megawatt hour. In Germany, 150, and in France, it would have been 160. So why did France come out relatively unscathed? Simple, they maxed out their nuclear energy stats, with 70% of their electricity coming from nuclear power, keeping costs as low as China's. Why do we even focus on energy-intensive industries? How many companies even rely on these energy-hungry processes? What, a couple of dozen? We focus on them because these industries aren't just a niche. They're hundreds of thousands of businesses across Europe, employing 8 million workers and generating 6% of the EU's total economic value. While many sectors found ways to dodge the crisis, these heavyweights took the hardest hit. Production of paper, cement, glass, lime, concrete, basic metals and chemicals dropped 10 to 15% compared to 2021. And here, we need to remember that behind these boring charts lie enormous, real-world production operations. For example, a large Slovakian plant announced the shutdown of aluminium production due to high electricity prices. Plants in the Netherlands, Romania, and France reported reduced output as well. The paper industry across the European Union is facing temporary equipment shutdowns. Representatives from the glass industry are begging for any kind of action to save the situation. And the reason for all this: energy, 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 and energy. or rather the prices of it. But what's particularly important for today's story is the decrease in fertilizer production by the German giant BASF and the Norwegian company Yara. It might seem like ammonia production isn't a critical industry. After all, you wouldn't expect to see the root of food problems here, right? During the next period of doubling, where will the food be found to satisfy the importunate demands of the increasing numbers? Where is the fresh land to turn up? Where is the dressing necessary to improve that which is already in cultivation? There is no person with the smallest knowledge of land but would say that it was impossible that the average produce of the country could be increased during the second 25 years by a quantity equal to what it at present yields. Yet we will suppose this increase, however improbable, to take place. The exuberant strength of the argument allows of almost any concession. Even with this concession, however, there would be 7 millions at the expiration of the second term unprovided for. A quantity of food equal to the frugal support of 21 millions would be to be divided among 28 millions. These famous lines belong to the English cleric Thomas Malthus. Back in the late 18th century, he formulated a problem, no, more like a catastrophe looming over humanity. He hypothesized that if the population doubled every 25 years, by the second growth period, food shortages would inevitably arise. This is a simple way to visualize it. Malthus considered doubling the population, say from 7 million to 14 million, manageable. But once the numbers double again, society would inevitably cross the point of maximum food production that could support its reproduction. Crossing this point would place society into what is called the Malthusian trap, a literal Hunger Games for the right to remain a sole survivor. Even if we all turned vegan, removed every pasture and replaced them with crop fields, the math still wouldn't work. Why? Because soil needs fertilization. It can't just keep churning out wheat forever. In Malthus's time, the go-to fertilizer was manure. But in this hypothetical example, we've already ditched livestock. Therefore, humanity is doomed to reduce the number of its kind. But in reality, since 1800, when Malthus wrote these words, the population has indeed kept growing every 25 years. Not doubling, no, but growing at a significant pace, especially after the end of World War II, and we've managed to avoid the Malthusian trap. But how? All thanks to gas and the Germans who worked with it. I don't even want to know what you mean by that. Before researching this, I thought gas was just for heating homes and generating electricity. Turns out it's also used to fertilize soil. I learned this only while writing the script. Malthus was right about one thing: soil can't produce an infinite yield. Even in his time, people knew that maintaining soil fertility required cattle manure or bird guano. But as you can guess, extracting these fertilizers on an industrial scale is quite challenging. That was the case until the early 20th century, when German chemists Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch discovered the industrial synthesis of ammonia. The key idea here is that natural gas can be converted into hydrogen, and when hydrogen is combined with nitrogen, it leads to the Haber-Bosch process, ammonia production. Ammonia is the basis for most nitrogen fertilizers, such as urea, ammonium sulfate, and ammonium nitrate. In order to understand the importance of nitrogen fertilizers, let's look at this graph. This many people are fed by food grown without nitrogen fertilizers, and this many are eating fruits and vegetables from the soil enriched with gas. In other words, without nitrogen fertilizers, the world could only feed half its current population. Like the rest of the world, the European Union depends on these fertilizers. Unlike some other regions, the EU doesn't produce enough of them and must import about 30% of its nitrogen fertilizers. And you remember that these fertilizers come from natural gas. So, if gas prices spike, so do fertilizer costs. Just look at these charts. First, the price of natural gas. Now, the price of nitrogen fertilizers. See the pattern? It gets even worse when we add phosphates, 70% imported, and potash, almost entirely imported. We can see how the price of natural gas affects their costs. It's worth mentioning that gas prices and, consequently, fertilizer prices started rising even before the war in Ukraine, but the conflict only made things worse. A dramatic price surge across all three categories occurred in March 2022. Behind these boring graphs are real businesses and real people, farmers in this case. On the screen you can see columns of tractors blocking roads, and here protesters are actively dumping manure on the streets of Brussels. All because of the rising prices for electricity, gas, fuel and fertilizers that are essential for growing various crops. It's worth noting that wasn't the only reason. In reality, many factors played a role here simultaneously. Diesel fuel used in tractors and combines also soared in price. Even though costs have slightly dropped, they're still painfully high. Here's a map of protests across Europe, and the top complaint is high costs. In Italy and Greece, people protested fuel and electricity prices. In France, Romania and Germany, the issue was cuts to diesel subsidies. Other protests focused on government regulations and new taxes, but the most widespread anger came from cheap imports. And that's where we'll delve deeper. As part of its support for Ukraine, the EU removed trade barriers with Kiev in 2022. Normally, tariffs protect local farmers by making imported goods more expensive and also boost budgets and stimulate the price growth of the products we buy every day. But when those barriers disappeared, Ukrainian became much more attractive than local ones. Despite the war, Ukraine actually increased its exports, especially agricultural products like sunflower oil, corn and rapeseed. This was great for some, but devastating for local farmers in Poland, Romania and France. But cheap agricultural imports affected more countries than just those we've mentioned. For instance, the European Parliament noted that 200,000 farmers from Italy launched a petition asking to protect local wheat producers due to the flood of cheap Ukrainian agricultural imports into the country. Meanwhile, if the sanctions policy had remained unchanged for all 3 years, the crisis could have only worsened. For example, on April the 8th, 2022, despite the rising prices already taking effect, the EU imposed a ban on the import of fertilizers from Russia. However, just a week later, these overly harsh restrictions had to be softened. On April the 17th, the EU clarified that fertilizers could be imported through the EU to third countries that are not part of the Union. Then, on June the 14th, they clarified that the ban was universal, with no exceptions regardless of the final destination of the fertilizers. On September the 19th, it was again clarified that fertilizers from Russia could be imported through the EU to third countries. By the end of 2022, the EU had completely reversed the ban and allowed direct imports.
That's right, keep moving!
You know what? Yeah.
Except you stay.
Back then, it seemed like a minor policy shift, but today we see how interconnected everything was from the start. To roughly assess the scale of the consequences, let's take a look at how much fertilizer the EU imports in total. You can see the numbers on the screen. And where does Russia fit into all this? Like it or not, Russia supplies about 25% of the EU's total fertilizers. While that share dipped in 2022, it barely made a dent. By 2024, imports were back to pre-COVID levels. In other words, a full import ban in 2022 would have dealt a significant blow to Europe's economy and agriculture, even though, despite that, prices still rose substantially. This brings us to another sensitive topic for any consumer: inflation. Now, let me show you what real stability looks like. And here it is, 1.6%. That's the average annual inflation rate across the Eurozone over the past 20 years. Then, in 2022, inflation soars to 8.5%. The situation in the European Union itself is even more critical, inflation hitting nearly 10%. For Russia, the main instigator, these numbers are quite ordinary. Even before the war, inflation there routinely hit 11%, 13% and 12%. But for Europe, where stable prices are the norm, this was a shockwave, triggering unrest, protests and strikes. As always, averages hide the real drama. Take Estonia, for example, which saw the highest price increase in the entire EU, 20% inflation rate. Its Baltic neighbours, Latvia and Lithuania, weren't far behind. Meanwhile, France was one of the A-grade students, keeping inflation at just 6%. Can you guess what could explain this massive gap? Simple: energy dependence. The more a country relied on Russian energy, the harder it got hit by the crisis. The three most dependent nations saw inflation rates soaring well past the EU average. Take France, for example, which not only is not dependent on Russian gas but also has a high share of nuclear energy in its energy balance. But hold on, if Estonia is considered moderately dependent, why did prices rise the most there? Great question. The answer is more complex than a simple energy table. Estonia is indeed moderately dependent on Russian energy resources, with gas making up only 10% of the country's energy consumption. However, that entire 10% came exclusively from Russia. Estonia does not produce any gas domestically, it simply doesn't exist. Meanwhile, natural gas is used for industrial production and heating in entire regions. In 2021, Estonia imported 94% of its gas directly from Russia. Then there's oil. Estonia doesn't refine its own, importing everything it consumes, but here's the twist: it largely runs on shale oil instead of conventional crude. That sounds like an energy security win, until sanctions on Russian energy sent fuel prices in Estonia soaring, far above EU averages. No wonder, given the obvious desire to detach from the gas diplomacy of its unruly neighbour. But since Estonia has neither oil refineries nor LNG terminals, the sanctions against Russia gave a powerful push to fuel price increases in the country, well above the average European levels. In addition to gas, energy prices in Estonia in June 2022 were rising twice as fast as in the rest of the Eurozone. So, on paper, everything seems great when energy security is technically in place, but due to a bottleneck in the energy sector, prices can skyrocket more than in other places. And here's another surprising fact: high inflation was partly caused by too good economic conditions.
What?
The thing is, after the pandemic, the Baltic country bounced back too quickly. Production grew by 7%. The demand for labor turned into a shortage, which in turn led to wage increases. And as we know, wage growth fuels price increases and fosters inflation. The universal weapon against inflation is raising interest rates. As war and inflation shook Europe, the European Central Bank stepped in, raising interest rates step by step. By the end, it had climbed to an unprecedented 4.5%. For developing economies, 4.5% might not sound like much, but in the Eurozone, where one single rate has to fit many different economies, this was a high-stakes balancing act. After 2022, inflation across the Eurozone began falling fast and is now approaching more familiar levels. And let's not forget that the Eurozone consists of many countries with different economies, and there is one single rate for all of them. It is even more challenging to find an optimal value when inflation approaches 20% in Estonia, 9% in Germany, and only 6% in France. So, does that mean Europe suffered the most over the past 3 years? Some might interpret it that way, but it's important to understand that the situation is not solely the result of sanctions and conflict. Economic downturns rarely emerge overnight. They are often the consequence of long-term, gradual trends that become glaringly obvious only in times of crisis. Take a look at the European Union's GDP growth over the past 60 years. Since the mid-1980s, a subtle yet persistent slowdown has taken hold. Don't let the 2021 spike confuse you. That's just the classic low base effect at play. After the severe economic contraction in 2020 due to COVID restrictions, the subsequent recovery made growth appear dramatic in comparison. A similar trend appears when examining Europe's trade performance. Here we see a similar pattern. Slowly but surely, year after year, exports have declined relative to past decades. The financial and commercial landscape of today is noticeably weaker than it was 20 years ago. Even European officials are not pretending that everything is going according to plan. The European Commission enlisted the former head of the European Central Bank to analyze the economic trajectory, and his findings were direct and unfiltered.
We have said many times that growth has been slowing down for a long time in Europe, but we've ignored it. Until 2 years ago, we would never have such a conversation as the one we're having today. Because things were sort of going well. We were doing well out of globalization. Unemployment was steadily falling. And now we cannot ignore it any longer. Now conditions have changed. World trade is slowing. China is actually slowing very much, but it's become much less open to us. And actually it's competing with us in global markets on all accounts. We've lost our main supplier of cheap energy, Russia, and now we have to start for our defense, again for the first time since the Second World War.
Currently, the European Union is walking a tightrope. On one side, it must support its economy. Tax breaks and subsidies in 2022 alone cost the EU a significant 2% of GDP. On the other, it seeks to safely reduce reliance on unreliable energy partners without triggering further inflation or economic turmoil. While some sanctions on fertilizers were eased in 2022, the focus has now shifted toward banning agricultural imports entirely. Whether this approach is the result of strategic foresight or a confrontation at any cost mindset remains to be seen. What is clear, however, is that maintaining unity across 27 diverse nations is not an easy task. Negotiations become especially complex when countries like Hungary and Germany are eager to resume Russian gas imports, while France remains unaffected and Norway is thriving with the increased demand for its energy resources. The situation is undeniably challenging, but far from catastrophic. No one in Europe froze because of the increase in electricity and gas prices, but the economic strain is real. Households are paying higher prices, and the continent's energy vulnerabilities have been laid bare. What Europe chooses to do next will shape its future resilience. You know who to share this video with. And I'm the researcher.